Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of Find Your Free, the podcast. I am your hostess, Rachel Voss, and here we are at the top of another week. And the space between the last podcast and this episode has been quite eventful. So on the Friday before recording this, so today is Monday morning, April 12th, and we are officially in new moon in Aries. And on the Friday before recording, so Friday, April 9th, the rapper, actor, human, DMX, born into this world as Earl Simmons, made his transition. And many of you who listen to this podcast may know of DMX, may know his music closely. Maybe you only know a few songs. Maybe you know the one song that we all know, Lose My Mind. Maybe you know him as an actor. Maybe you just heard of him around the way. Maybe you never heard of him at all. But DMX made his entry, onto the hip hop scene technically before I started college, but became known to the world when I was in college. And David can check me on this, but I think it was 1998 when his two debut albums, or I guess you get one debut album, but two albums, introduced DMX to us. And I was in college at that time. And, just like, we have our childhood memories like Bob Ross and Reading Rainbow and Saturday morning cartoons. If anybody is listening to this, say under probably 35 at this point, you may be like, Saturday morning, what? So I might be dating myself a little bit there. But yeah, there are certain memories that take us right back to our childhood. There are memories that, remind us where we were when we were teenagers, or when we had our first kiss, or when we first went to the mall, just certain movies, music, smells, things, take us back to certain points in our time. And for me, college was certainly a very critical time in my life. And I remember first hearing DMX, he was different, and he was just energetic, you know what I mean? And it was just a vibe, and it was just a good time, good music to be, to kind of support, or not support, but to be the soundtrack. That's what I'm trying to say, of my life at the time. And I just think about so much of where I see the world going now with social media and people just, plugged into their phones and, music and all that type of stuff. It makes me so fortunate. On the one hand, I feel like time is just flying. Like I saw a meme the other day that was like, kids these days are talking about kids in the 90s the way kids in the 90s talked about kids in the 60s. And that really struck me because I, born in the 70s, raised in the 80s, came of age, in the 90s. Like in 1990, I turned 13, So, you know what I mean? And I just remember then kind of being very into what, I had learned about Woodstock in the 60s, and the Wonder Years were out at that time. And the Wonder Years was a show based in the 60s, So I had my own little obsession with the 60s and the 90s. I always felt like, oh, I should have been at Woodstock, right? So seeing that meme about kids today talking about kids in the 90s, it's like, dang, yeah, it has been, we're at that 30-year mark now, right? And so time, it's just so fleeting, but I'm just so grateful, very grateful to have been, a child, to have been a product, of the 90s. I really am, because it was just a great time for certain social change. It was a great time for music. It was a great time for hip hop. It was just, a great time. And I'm just really, just looking back, I'm really grateful that was the time of my coming of age. And so anyway, so DMX made his, made his entry onto the scene at that time. And, from that time and for many years after that, he just continued to be a part of that musical soundtrack, of my life. And to know DMX, or to at least know a little bit about his story, is to know that he suffered for a long time, for a long, long time, for a long, long time, from childhood, on. And a lot of his music conveyed that suffering. I imagine was an outlet for that suffering. And he was certainly a soul, that was heavy. And that I think is what, that I know, not I think, that I know is what made him so relatable to many. As New York and as rough as he might come across and be, he was extremely vulnerable. And his music was evidence, of that vulnerability. And so, to see him go from music, making that transition into acting, having also witnessed the life of Tupac, his music, his transition into acting, and then his very, very, very untimely death. To see DMX kind of go in that route, it was like, all right, you know what I mean? Like, let's go. Belly, while it may not be, the best movie made ever and the best acting, for me, it is like one of my top 10 all-time favorite movies. Absolute, hip hop cultural icon of a movie. And so, I'm just sharing all this to say that, like, many, I definitely felt his transition. He was only 50, but he had a whole lot of life in those 50 years. And, for people who may not have known, his music, for people who only knew him from the headlines or just, judging a book by its cover, frankly, to hear like, oh, OD or this or that. Yeah, of course he died from drugs, and, just kind of write him off. And it's like, it's not that simple. That man struggled with addiction. That man struggled with childhood trauma. That man had many, other traumas. And it's not just, oh, he was just some, drug addict who couldn't get his life together. And frankly, the initial news that came out was like OD, but we don't know that. Anyway, this is not like a music podcast, right? I'm just kind of getting into my thoughts about it all because, at the end of the day, he was a human being with a little bit of a burdened soul, maybe a lot of bit of a burdened soul. That's not for me to say either way, but certainly there was some burden. And then you have that with this raw talent, and if you're a hip hop fan, like, you appreciate, his talent, his music, his, just his presence, in the hip hop scene. And, that is what hurt, is just like, oh man, that brother hurt. But then at the same time, you know what I mean? It's like, now he's free. His spirit is free, right? And so I was definitely feeling that on Friday. I shed a couple of tears. Actually, I usually, I'm very vulnerable on my Instagram, but I usually don't do like crying in my stories and stuff like that. But man, I was touched on Friday, and I shared a story in the space, shedding some tears, about just not taking life for granted, and, not writing off people who have mental health challenges or addiction challenges and stuff like that. I shared a story from that place. I was really feeling it. And excuse me, I know there are people feeling it 10 times, as much as me, people who've had experiences similar to what DMX went through. And so his music in that way was extremely relatable. For me, it was just like, again, his music is part of a very significant memory and time in my life. And so his transition is like, oh my God, a piece of that time kind of going away, like when they say there goes another piece of my childhood, you know what I mean? It's like, there goes another piece of my college life, So in thinking about that, and his passing, and just, the time in my life when we were first introduced to DMX, and like where I am now, and I was thinking about that, I said to David, I was like, a lot of people who know me now, know me as like yoga Rachel, know me as like post corporate Rachel, right? Post college Rachel, right? Like they just know me as this person who is working, in the name of healing and freedom and liberation and, empowerment, right? And restoration. Like that's how a lot of people know me. And it's just what it is. Life happens. You have college, you have moving, you have careers, and, you meet people. People come in and out of your life. And so, not everybody is with you through every stage of your life. And if you have somebody that has been, how blessed you are. Shout out to my childhood best friend. She's been with me since 6, and we're 43. So there you go. But, so certainly people that I met in my yoga life and in my yoga world have no idea, about the college Rachel and the party girl Rachel and, the Rachel who was just not aware and, all that stuff. And I was thinking about that. And I was like, if you follow me enough, I like hip hop. I mean, I'm a music lover, period. Like I love all kinds of music. But hip hop is something that I grew up on, being, again, that child coming up in the 80s, coming of age in the 90s, and literally growing up in New York City's backyard. New York is the home. New York City is the home and the birth, of hip hop. So to grow up in that backyard and with an older brother who was literally growing up as hip hop was growing up, that is, hip hop and R&B, is my musical foundation. Like that's the music I remember being introduced to. So anybody who looks at my page, or looks at my stories, knows I like hip hop music, right? And knows I like old school hip hop music. I don't really keep up too tough with like what is called, hip hop and rap today. But again, that's not this podcast at all. Actually, that's a cultural hip hop music podcast. Anyway, saying all that to say that in thinking about that and sharing that with David, it just kind of got me to thinking about how I carry myself in life in general, right? And in the sense, and how many of us carry ourselves in life in general, right? So I've talked a lot about being mixed. I had a whole podcast episode about, having a black mom and a white dad and, that experience growing up and how being interracial shaped me and, all that type of stuff. But reflecting back on that and reflecting back on like this yoga life versus all of my life before, yoga was life. It just got me thinking about this idea of duality, not even the idea, like the concept, you know what I mean? Like it's an actual thing, like duality is a thing, right? And how, we may struggle with feeling like we have all these different parts of ourselves and like I have to show this part to this person and this part to this person and, this part to the corporate world, a little bit, not even a lot of it, that is part of the everyday trauma, that my people, Black people, suffer from. We suffer from, what is called the code switching, right? Like we're one way, and everybody, I think, a little bit is like this, right? Not anybody just goes into work just cursing and singing and doing whatever, right? Everybody has their like, okay, I got to put on my corporate hat, if you would. But, in terms of Black trauma, the trauma of being Black, it's like, it's that feeling of like, I can't fully be who I am because who I am is judged and I have to look like this and I have to talk like this and, all that type of stuff. And so, so that's some of the trauma, that Black people suffer from. But in general, just speaking in general, to humanity, like in general, like we all have those spaces where like, we're one way with this, entity, we're another way with this entity. I know I even feel like that, like in my family sometimes, you know what I mean? It's just like, I'm super vocal or whatever, like in my life. And then because I'm like the baby sister in the family, like I'll immediately like clam up. And sometimes I'll feel like my family doesn't know me for like who I really am and, all that type of stuff. But at the end of the day, it comes down to a choice that I make, right? To either turn my voice on or turn my voice off. It comes to a choice I make to either show the world like just yoga Rachel, or to say like, no, there's this whole other part of me, right? Like, and so duality is something I have always struggled with. I just didn't know it under the context of duality. But again, just black and white, like, being like one way with my black family and feeling like I have to be another way with my white family, and listening to hip hop with my black family, and then going to my white family and just like, oh, classical music is fine because, you know what I mean? Like, I'm afraid to be who I am, you know what I mean? And so I was just thinking about all that, right? And so have all this thought about like, and I was telling David, I was like, man, I got to go through the garage and go through our boxes, and like, I need to do a complete photo dump of like pictures from when I was in college. Cause see, like, my pictures of my life are not on my phone, my pictures of my life now, but all of my pictures, if I even took pictures, okay, like, that's why sometimes like it's interesting for me now, like when it comes to like social media marketing and making sure you take pictures in the moment, like, I didn't come up like that. You know what I mean? Certainly there were cameras around and we took pictures of events and stuff like that. But like, for the most part, and anybody else who's in my age range, I'm sure you can relate. Like, when you were out with your friends and having a good time, like, and going out to eat, like, you weren't stopping and taking pictures of the food. You were being like in the moment, right? And now, because everything is driven by social media, and especially if you're like, an entrepreneur and a brand lifestyle person, which is all of the things that I am, it's like, okay, I have to show my life on social media. So I constantly have to remember like, oh shit, I got to take a picture of this. Oh shit, I forgot to take a picture of that. Right. Um, so I'm saying that to say, let me come back to center, because I'm losing my train of thought, getting all caught up into social media stuff. But yeah, I was saying about the photo dump, like, yeah, I should go through these boxes and like pull out these pictures of like when I was in college and, when I was like party girl and all of this, because I'm like, the world needs to know, like, to see Rachel before she was Rachel Voss Yoga, right? Like Rachel Voss, like Rachel Kamira, like Kamira is my middle name. And I thought about that, right? And so in just thinking about all of that, I also, as part of my eventful week between podcast episodes, I also had signed up and attended a 2-day workshop on Saturday and Sunday on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And so super quick yoga lesson. The Yoga Sutras sort of codify, I think it's codify, what the practice of yoga is. So the first sutra is, yoga is the practice that ceases the fluctuations of the mind. And it again codifies it. It puts the context around yoga of being this mind, body, spirit unification. Like, we're not just of mind, we're not just of body, we're not just in the spirit, but like, how do we unite, all of these aspects of us? And there are 195, maybe 196, sutras, some say 195, some say 196. But again, the sutras sort of codify, what the yoga practice is. That's where we get the message of steadiness and ease. We get the message of ceasing the fluctuations of the mind. We get the message of, our practice requires consistency, and the sutras say over lifetimes, and so I took a workshop on just doing a deeper dive into the Yoga Sutras, and how we can interweave that with like our asana, our yoga practice, and just really our everyday lives, because especially the way I teach, right? So like yoga, again, the introduction to yoga for many, especially many in this Western world, is asana, that physical practice on the mat, right? And it's a beautiful entryway. Not everybody's going to come in through the philosophical way. So the philosophy of yoga, that the practice of yoga, like as a lifestyle, like appeals to me and appealed to me in the training. The asana is part of that. The asana prepares us for meditation and focus and concentration and stuff. But the philosophy of yoga spoke to me. And so when I teach, I'm always, trying to weave in bits of philosophy. So to do a deeper dive, and to be able to have more understanding for myself so that I can share, this understanding with my students in my community, that it's not just about what we do in the body, right? It's about how we respond to challenges in our life. It's about, noticing what's going on in our mind. It's just about awareness, mind, body awareness. And so this workshop was led by this really, really, really cool dude that I follow on Instagram. And for the purposes of this podcast, I'm not going to say his name because I'm going to relate a story that he shared with us in Sacred Space. It is a story that he shared before, but I think it was like a really long time ago. And when he shared this story with us, he didn't say, "Oh, don't share it," but he said like, "Oh, I feel comfortable sharing because it's Sacred Space." And so to honor that, I don't want to say his name, and I'm not even going to say the full story, but I just want to relate something that he shared. So, we're in this workshop, and again, there's 195 sutras. So we only throughout this workshop maybe did a deep dive on like 5 or 6. And we talked about the first sutra. We talked about steadiness and ease. But in this discussion of the sutras, we got into a little bit of the discussion of duality versus non-duality, right? And so non-duality and duality could be 10,000 entire episodes, right? And it's one of those things that like I understand, my mind can wrap around it. I get it in theory and concept. I've studied it for a while. Duality and non-duality is a lifelong study. And it's something that I still need to, I can take what I understand about the sutras and weave that into class. I'm still learning to shape my words around duality and non-duality so that I can explain it in a way that's easily understood. I mean, on the surface, you might get a sense of like, duality is 2 different things, and then non-duality is not 2 different things, right? And so on the surface, it's like, okay, it makes sense. The idea of it, though, just super quick nuts and bolts. The idea of it, and Danae, who listens to this podcast regularly, shout out to you, Danae. She is a beautiful yoga teacher who I met through social media last year, in the year that was 2020. And she's a beautiful yoga teacher out of California. We have yet to meet in person again because we met in 2020. But, we're just 2 souls who found each other, and Danae comes to my yoga classes. And I was just telling her last week, because last week was also the 1-year anniversary of me teaching my virtual yoga classes, and Danae has been coming to those classes probably since the summertime. And I was telling her like, yeah, Danae, I always get intimidated when you come because, like when another yoga teacher comes to your class, it's like, oh, they're judging me, so I'm thinking about Danae listening to this and me breaking down the sutras and what she's thinking and what she might be thinking about this conversation of duality versus non-duality. So shout out to you, Danae. I appreciate you very much, my sister. Anyway, but in a really quick nutshell, duality is this idea of being like fragmented, right? Which is what so many of us are feeling or sensing when we come to the mat. And it's like, how do I take all these pieces and experiences and things, and just bring it all together and just be me, like, how do I just be me? Because again, we're one way in corporate world, one way with our family. If you're interracial or whatever, it's like, oh, I got to be, I'm this way with this part of my family. I'm this way and I'm too thick, and so it's just always this sort of division within ourselves, right? And then again, when you just add the world becoming what it is with social media and just everything at our fingertips, it's like, oh my God, who am I, in this, right? And non-duality is the non-fragmentation, right? It's about the wholeness. And so in getting into that story that was shared by the teacher, right? And I'm going to come back. I'm going to relate this to everything I was saying about DMX too. So it's all going to come together. I have this thought. So I have this thought pattern already going into the workshop about like college Rachel versus yoga Rachel, and you know what I mean, and just kind of like my own fragmentation, right? So I'm going into the workshop with this. We're getting into the sutras. We're doing our deep dive. We get into the discussion about duality versus non-duality, which is essentially what I'm struggling, right? Like the duality of Rachel and working towards the non-duality of Rachel, right? And so when we got into that discussion, the teacher that was, that was leading the workshop shared a story about when he lost a child by way of a miscarriage. And he, or it might have been a stillborn, I'm not sure. But he was able to hold his child, his child who had deceased. And he shared how he just wanted to hold on to that child to the point that he, wanted to like preserve her. And his teacher told him, the spirit of that child is not suffering. That spirit is fine. It's you who are suffering. You're suffering from this loss. You're suffering from this feeling. You're in, this human existence. And with this human existence comes suffering, which is one of the lines from DMX's most popular songs, to live a life is to suffer, and so, part of the human experience is suffering, right? Although the sutras also say suffering that has not yet been manifest is to be avoided. And I've shared that in my classes. If suffering can be avoided, it should be avoided, right? And again, that's when it comes down to awareness. Like, what are we choosing to hold on that we know is causing us pain versus, something like losing a child or, just something that's just completely like out of our control that causes us pain and suffering, right? So, his teacher said to him, you are feeling this pain, but the spirit of that child is free. Like, that child is fine. And again, relating that back to DMX and the freedom of his spirit, because in his human existence, there was a lot of suffering. And if you are into, this aspect of spirituality, then it's like, okay, I can take peace in the fact that his spirit's free. I wish he was here. I wish he didn't die young. I wish, he was, we just celebrated his life with his verses on Instagram with Snoop last year. He was working on an album, you know what I mean? So it's just like, oh, he's had so many pitfalls. You want to be here for the celebrations, And so anyway, so relating it back to the story. So the teacher said, the teacher of the workshop teacher said, yeah, like, you are suffering in your existence, but even beneath that suffering, you are still whole. This doesn't make you any less whole. This doesn't make you any less valuable, any less of who you are. Like, you came into this earthly plane, a whole spirit, a whole being, and you remain that way. Again, life happens to us and fragments us and takes us away from that sense of wholeness, right? From that sense of like, I'm okay even with all this life happening to me, right? Yoga is that practice that bridges that space, because when we don't have that sense of awareness and we're constantly in this like, oh my God, this is happening to me, we can't give ourselves room to see, well, what is happening for me? What am I to learn from this? You know what I mean? Like, what, or just how can I feel this but not sit in it for the rest of my life, because I'm still here, right? So while I'm still here, how can I live without really just being in the suffering all the time, right? So that's what yoga teaches us, all that awareness. So when he shared that, in that space of non-duality, in the sense of like, I'm still whole, like, I'm not this person who lost a child, and I'm not just going to be that person that just wants to hold on to that and forget about everything else, of who I am. And that even related to me, with my journey of, working to conceive my second child, and at this age, and, and the places that has taken me to in terms of, how I feel and the sadness and just the depths that you can go to when there's something you really want to manifest. And it's just like, what's happening? And so that's even something my rites of passage teachers always reminded me, like, who are you even without the, conceiving the second child? Like, just who are you? Who are you outside of all of that, right? You're still a whole being. So even though I'm on this journey, trying to conceive at the age of 43, like, I'm still a whole person. And I was really appreciative of him sharing that story, because it gave me peace in myself in that way. And then again, it related to this idea of like how we fragment, ourselves. Like, what do I want to say? Like, I guess I just want to say, like, because my therapist reminds me of this, our couples therapist reminds us of this, my rites of passage teacher reminds me of this yoga workshop reminds me of this. And so here I am reminding you of this and reminding myself of this. Like, we are whole beings no matter what. You know what I mean? Like, if you're really working for something but it's not panning out, if you're in a shitty place in your life right now or things feel shitty, you know what I mean? Like, you're still a whole person. And if you've forgotten that or you don't know what that looks like step back and who are you? You know what I mean? Like, who are you in this wholeness? And our couples therapist asked me that yesterday. And she asked David and I that individually. And we were like, we had all these answers for all these other questions. And then she was like, so who are you? And I'm like, a healer? A servant? Who are you? You know? And it may be a question that the answer is always elusive, you know, like, who am I? I don't know who I am. But at the same time, having that awareness that, well, I'm always whole. You know what I mean? Like, that idea of non-duality. I'm always whole. I have to be this way and that way. And you know what I mean? Like, I'm not these fragments. Like, I'm a whole being, you know, I'm a whole spirit. I'm, you know, in this human existence. And so when I bring that back, you know, to what I was thinking when DMX made his transition, like, yeah, like, you know, the world doesn't know like Party Rachel and this and that. Not that y'all need to see every aspect of my life, because there was some reasons I didn't take pictures, right? But it's like, it's just got me to thinking about me still being on my own journey of duality and working towards this space of non-duality, and non-duality equating me being authentically who I am, right? Like, that's what it is. You know, again, it's not like, you know, I'm not going to walk unless it's like a hip hop yoga class. Like, no, I'm not going to walk into a yoga studio saying like, you know, fuck this, and you know, like whatever. Like, I'm going to walk in, I'm going to honor the space, right? I'm going to put my yoga mode on, right? You know, I have a part-time job. Like, I'm going to walk in and I'm going to walk in with etiquette or, you know, professionalism or whatever it is, right? You know what I mean? So like, yeah, we gotta adjust, you know what I mean, to the environments that we're a part of. But how do we still make those adjustments and still be non-dual, right? And still be whole and still be authentic? Like, I was just thinking about that with my part-time job. You know, last week I just had the good fortune of working with this, it's a holistic health university here in Maryland. And, you know, we have conversations about racism and systemic racism and you know, just these, you know, just different, there's this one group of us that we have like a meeting every week, and we talk about all these societal things that I would have never talked about or been able to talk about in my corporate excuse me, you know, my traditional corporate 9 to 5 life. Like, I would have never been able to have these conversations publicly. Yeah, maybe with my Black coworker or whatever, but not in a diverse group, certainly not at a staff meeting. And so to have opportunities to talk about my experience as a Black woman during this time, and to talk about how I feel and to not be judged. You know, we were having a conversation, you know, one of these conversations last week. And again, I really just showed up like as me, saying how I felt. And I came down, I told David, I was like, man, it feels good to like have this part-time gig and totally just be myself. Like, yeah, I'm going to be professional. I may not be as, you know, laissez-faire as I might be at home, but you know what I mean? Like, but to be able to say what I think and what I feel without worry of like, are they going to fire me? You know what I mean? Because I said that. Like, it's like, no, it's invited, you know? Authenticity is invited. And so I know this episode might feel a little all over the place, but certainly I hope there's an understanding, or, you know, I hope that you're able to wrap your mind and your arms around this reminder and this understanding that I'm trying to bring to you about just being who you are. You know what I mean? Being authentic, finding your free is literally the journey of living your most authentic life. You know, coming home to yourself, Like duality is, or it can be the experience of like leaving home and never coming back. And like it's fun at first and you're going out into the world and doing all of this. But then it's like, well, where's my anchor? You know what I mean? Like, where's that place I can come back to and feel rooted and feel grounded and feel like me? You know what I mean? Like, I've talked in a couple episodes. My family, they drive me nuts sometimes. You know what I mean? But I love them. They're the center that I return to. You know what I mean? Like, I'm very fortunate that, I know at the end of the day, and certainly God willing, when this, world opens up in a way where we can all safely be together and all that stuff, like I can go home and sit, with my family and get a hug and get that love and get that sense of restoration. So what is that for you? Not everybody's anchor is their family. Some it's their partner, some it's their pet, some it's their place that they go to. I know I would encourage, right? Like finding that in ourselves too. Like it's really good to have these places of refuge, but ultimately the anchor is ourselves, right? And that's why it's like, in that space of anchoring, when we go back to that first Yoga Sutra, yoga is the practice of ceasing the fluctuations of the mind, so the ups and downs of the minds. And the way that we achieve that is by not attaching our mind and our worth and our sense of self to external things. And I say that all the time in podcasts, and I say that all the time in class. Things fluctuate, life fluctuates, people fluctuate, right? But we attach our mind to our breath. We attach our mind to our sense of self and knowing who we are. Yeah, we as humans, we fluctuate because life happens and we respond to those things. But when we find that anchoring in ourselves, right? That sense of wholeness, that sense of like, no matter what happens, I'm still a whole being. We can anchor ourselves to that. That's what helps us reduce the fluctuations, right? That's what helps us cease the fluctuations and just be, and just be. So, I told myself this was not going to be an hour-long podcast, and I'm really going to hold true to that today. Just because it gets super deep, and I just kind of want to leave it at that for now. Just who are you, right? Who are you? And what makes you whole? And can you find that sense of wholeness? And have you been struggling with duality? And what does non-duality look like for you? And are you going through something? Are you experiencing suffering right now? And are you letting yourself be defined by that suffering? A story I relate to, I'm sure I've shared this. If I haven't, I will again, or I will at some point. Like when my son's father decided to split, like we got divorced when my son was just 1.5, 2 years old. But, we co-parented from 2 to 8. It wasn't always the most joyful experience, but we co-parented. And then when my son was 8, he decided he needed to go find himself, and he split and moved thousands of miles away on the drop of a dime. And for a long time, that defined me. Like anytime somebody would ask me about like Voss or his dad, like if somebody didn't know, like the first thing that was coming out my mouth was like, you know what this motherfucker did? You know what I mean? Like this motherfucker really just left me to raise this kid all by myself. Like what the fuck? And I heard myself one day let that be the initial response. And I was like, you know what? I got to stop defining my life and myself by that experience. And yeah, that shit hurt. And yeah, that shit kicked me in my ass. And yeah, that shit hurts my son more than it actually hurts me. It's a struggle trying to do it, but I don't have to live it. That's my son's experience, right? But I can't let that define me anymore. I cannot sit in that suffering, So it's not to say suffering doesn't happen. It's not to say bypass the suffering. No, honor what you're experiencing, but having the awareness not to define yourself by that thing. Like you're not identified by your suffering. Why? Because you're still a whole being. Even identifying yourself with the suffering is an aspect of duality, which it relates back to the story the teacher shared about losing his child, that he was just immersed in that his whole life was the loss of his child. And his teacher reminded him, you're more than that. That's just a part of your experience, but you're still whole. You don't have to identify your whole life with that. So, my loves, I offer that to you to just think about being whole, thinking about where you are experiencing duality and where you can bring your worlds together to just be who you are, because it's fucking a lot of work to carry all those different hats and to try to be all these different things for everybody, because in the end, the one who suffers the most is you. And as the sutra said, and as my teachers taught me, if suffering can be avoided, it should be avoided. So don't cause yourself suffering trying to be everything to everything else, everybody else, or everything else, Just be your beautiful, whole self, Be who you came into this world as, because that's who we need. We don't need people who are trying to be everything to everybody, because that's all everybody's trying to do now. We need people who are aware, who are moving in their authenticity, whether other people like it or not. You know what I mean? Not everybody might like this vibe that I'm on. Not everybody from my college days might like hippie Rachel, right? Although I think most people would expect it. But you know what I mean? And hey, if it's not for you, it's not for you. But I gotta be me. I gotta be non-dual me. And so I offer the same to you. So with that, lovelies, we'll go ahead and rest this conversation here. Again, as always, I hope this resonates. Certainly, as I always offer, if this is something that you want to talk to me about behind the scenes, do reach out, rachelvossyoga.com. You can contact me through my website. I'm on the socials, Rachel Voss Yoga, on Instagram primarily, so you can reach me that way. Just let me know your thoughts. Let me know your experience. Yeah. And just, again, remember to be whole you, And so let's go ahead and close out with a passage. Today's passage is from Melody Beattie's Journey to the Heart, Daily Meditations on the Path to Freeing Your Soul. And wherever you are, get nice and comfortable. So if you're sitting, find a tall spine. If you're lying down, maybe feel the spine release into the ground, or wherever you are. Take a deep breath in. Exhale, letting out a full breath out through the mouth. Maybe letting your eyes close or finding a soft gaze. And this passage is called Come Back to Center. Come back to center, that place in you that is still, calm, quiet, and connected. Your center is a place you can trust. It connects the body, mind, heart, and soul. It connects truth, your inner voice, and the divine. Your best work comes from there. Your most loving times come from there. Your insights, awarenesses, and guidance come from being there at that place. Your best decisions and finest moments come from that place. Your center is a place that is quietly confident, unassuming, spontaneous, and free. It is gentle and kind, but it has the power to defend instinctively against attack. Your center is a place that is naturally joyful and at peace. It is accepting, non-judgmental, and it channels the voice of your heart. It knows perfect timing. It knows the rhythm of the universe, the rhythm of all creation, and it delights in its connection to that rhythm. If you must leave your center to learn a lesson, feel a feeling, or experience something new, do that. Take all the side trips you are called to, but come back to your center when you're done. And go to your center first before you go anywhere else. Oh man, so, when I was looking through, my books, I was like, I gotta find the right passage. And then I landed on that one. And I was like, that's it. Your center that space where you are whole, that space that you can trust. It's in you. It's in you. And so, again, just thinking about this idea of non-duality and finding your center and being whole, just take time to reflect on that. Maybe after you listen to this podcast, maybe you'll carve out some time for that work. But on the journey of authenticity, remembering that you're whole. And if people don't even rock, with who you are authentically, then those are not the people for you. You will find your people, and your people will find you. That I can testify to. All right, so with that, lovelies, we'll just close it out first, again, by just offering condolences to the family of DMX, to his children, to his fans, to everybody who knew and loved him. I just wish him peaceful transition, peaceful journey, and the experience of eternal peace. And may you be happy. May you be free. May you be peaceful, easeful, useful, and joyful. The light in me honors the light in each of you. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you next week.